Okay, let's unpack this. Today we're diving into a topic that feels, well, more relevant than ever in our interconnected world. Bicultural identity integration, or BII.
hmm
And if you're an educator listening in, maybe majoring in elementary education, or perhaps you're just getting curious about how identity works, especially in a diverse classroom, this deep dive is really designed with you in mind.
Yeah, absolutely.
We've got a fascinating set of sources here, a really foundational chapter from a leading handbook on identity theory and research. We're going to try to extract the core insights, translate some complex ideas into clear, actionable understanding.
And what's fascinating here, I think, is how this research helps us peer into the complex internal world of individuals who navigate multiple cultures. It's quite something.
It really is.
So our mission today is to pull out the most important insights, especially thinking about how these ideas can illuminate our understanding of identity and psychology. And particularly for those of you working with young learners who are just beginning to form their sense of self in this multicultural world we live in.
Right.
We'll explore the how and why of managing these dual identities, and crucially, what this means for things like well-being, cognitive development, and even, how people think.
Think of it maybe as a shortcut, a way to truly understand what it means for someone to live across two cultures and how that shapes them. Sometimes in surprising ways, right?
Absolutely, sometimes in incredibly powerful ways.
We're talking about tangible insights you can hopefully apply, whether you're supporting a student in your classroom, trying to build a more inclusive school environment, or, just looking to better understand the rich tapestry of identities all around you.
A very rich tapestry indeed.
So to kick us off, let's try and define our terms a bit.
Yeah.
What exactly is biculturalism, and why has it become such a central topic in identity studies right now? It feels like something that's only going to grow in importance.
Well, if we connect this to the bigger picture, the sheer numbers really tell a story that's impossible to ignore.
Okay.
Our sources highlight this dramatic global demographic shift. I mean, since 1970, international migration has literally doubled worldwide.
Doubled. Wow.
Yeah. To put a finer point on it, around 175 million people are now living outside their birth country. And if you look at the more developed regions, it's about 1 in 10 people who is an international migrant.
1 in 10. That's a staggering figure.
It really is. And it indicates that encountering multiple cultures isn't really an anomaly anymore. It's becoming a widespread human experience.
That really underscores why this isn't just some academic curiosity, doesn't it?
Right.
It's a practical reality for so many communities, so many classrooms.
It absolutely is. And this phenomenon, it extends far beyond just migration, Well, think about advances in technology. They've shrunk the world, haven't they? Allowing for so much more cross-cultural contact through everything from, say, social media to global travel.
Right. You can connect with anyone anywhere.
Exactly. And globalization has intensified economic and cultural exchanges, bringing people from different backgrounds into closer proximity, maybe working together, living side by side. And even shifts in societal attitudes, like towards interethnic marriage, have drastically increased the number of bicultural individuals across the globe as families themselves become these multicultural units.
Okay.
So all of these forces combined mean that the number of people navigating multiple cultural worlds is just larger than ever before.
That really broadens our understanding of who falls under this bicultural umbrella, doesn't it? Because when I hear bicultural, maybe my mind first goes to immigrants or perhaps children of immigrants.
Well,
But your point suggests it's much wider than that.
Precisely. Traditionally, we might indeed think of bicultural individuals primarily as, immigrants, refugees, ethnic minorities, or maybe mixed ethnic individuals.
Yeah.
However, the sources clarify that it's not limited to those who are part of a cultural minority group.
Okay, interesting. Like who else?
Well, for example, individuals from the dominant group, let's say a non-Hispanic white American who has lived abroad for a long time, perhaps teaching English in another country and really immersing themselves in the local customs and language, they could be considered bicultural.
Ah, I see, because they've internalized that second culture.
Exactly. Or even someone in an interethnic relationship right here at home who actively internalizes and engages with their partner's distinct cultural background alongside their own.
Right.
The core definition, as our sources state it, is simply people who have been exposed to and have internalized at least two cultures.
Right.
So, yeah, it's a much wider, more inclusive group than many might initially assume, which makes this concept incredibly relevant to almost any classroom or community setting you might encounter.
With so many people identifying as bicultural or potentially falling into that category, it makes me wonder, how did the earliest research actually begin to sort of categorize these experiences? Were there specific types of biculturals they identified, or was it a more general approach back then?
That's a really fundamental question. The early literature, especially the work stemming from acculturation studies, which, broadly speaking, examine how individuals adapt when they encounter a new culture, identified four main strategies.
Four strategies.
Yeah, four main strategies that individuals might employ. They were conceptualized almost like pathways or orientations people could take.
What were they?
Well, first there was integration. This is what we now largely refer to as biculturalism. It means actively being involved in both the dominant culture and one's ethnic culture, finding ways to blend or manage belonging to both.
Okay, involved in both. Makes sense.
Then there was assimilation. This involves maybe shedding ties to one's ethnic culture and primarily engaging with the dominant culture only, sort of adopting the new culture's norms and values, sometimes to the exclusion of their heritage.
Right, becoming part of the mainstream.
Exactly. Third was separation. Here, individuals choose to be involved almost exclusively in their ethnic culture, often maintaining a deliberate distance from the dominant culture. They might preserve their language, traditions, social networks from their heritage country.
Okay, focusing inward on their own group.
Precisely. And finally, there was marginalization. This is maybe the most challenging strategy, where individuals feel involved in neither culture. They might feel alienated from their ethnic group, but also struggle to connect with or gain acceptance from the dominant culture.
Wow, that sounds incredibly difficult, feeling disconnected from both worlds.
It certainly presents unique challenges.
Yeah.
So those were the four main paths identified early on.
So those are the four distinct paths people might take when encountering a new culture, ranging from fully embracing both to feeling disconnected from all. What did the research tell us about which of these paths was most common in practice? Did most people pick one extreme?
Well, what's particularly fascinating here, and this was a key finding, is that research consistently showed that the majority of acculturating individuals actually adopt the integration strategy.
A majority, so most people were trying to engage with both.
That's right, they are in fact bicultural. And this was a truly critical finding because it fundamentally shifted the focus of the research.
How so?
Instead of primarily comparing bicultural individuals to those who assimilated or separated, researchers realized the more fruitful avenue was to understand the differences among bicultural individuals themselves.
Okay. Not if they integrate, but how they integrate.
Exactly. They started asking, are all bicultural individuals the same? Or do they experience and integrate their two cultures in different ways? And this line of inquiry directly led to the development of those early typologies of bicultural individuals you asked about.
Now, for educators listening, this next part sounds particularly insightful. Thinking about students in a classroom, what were some of those initial frameworks for understanding different types of bicultural individuals, and how might we observe them?
Yeah, this is where it gets practical. The sources describe several important and influential typologies from that era. For instance, Ramirez back in 1984 identified a few types. One prominent one was the synthesized multicultural individual.
Synthesize. Okay, what does that mean?
This person was considered the true bicultural, someone who is not only highly competent in both cultures, but also deeply committed to both. They feel a genuine sense of belonging and value in both their cultural worlds. It's a seamless blend.
Can you give us a classroom example of that?
Sure. Imagine a student, let's call her Maya. She's from a Chinese-American background. Maya fluently switches between speaking Mandarin with her family and perfect idiomatic English with her friends and teachers. No problem.
Okay.
She comfortably participates in both Lunar New Year celebrations with her extended family and traditional American holidays like Thanksgiving with her school friends, effortlessly navigating the different social norms of each.
So she's comfortable in both settings.
Right. And maybe in a history project, she might proactively suggest researching a topic, say, the development of democracies, from both an American and a Chinese historical perspective. She's seamlessly blending her understanding and showing commitment to both traditions. She draws on perspectives from both, showing a genuine, organic commitment. That's synthesized.
Got it. Very integrated. What else did Ramirez find?
Then, Ramirez also described the functional multicultural individual. This type was further divided into either a mainstream orientation or an ethnic orientation.
Functional, meaning they can operate in both.
Yes, exactly. These individuals are competent in both cultures, but, unlike the synthesized type, they are primarily committed to only one. They can operate effectively in both worlds, but their heart or primary allegiance lies more with one culture over the other.
Okay, so competent everywhere, but identify more strongly with one. Can we have an example of that too?
Absolutely.
Mm.
Consider a student named Luis. He's incredibly articulate in English. He excels in all his mainstream school activities, from debate club to student government, wide circle of friends from the dominant culture. Clearly highly competent and successful within the mainstream culture.
Just like it.
However, you might notice he rarely speaks about his family's Salvadoran heritage in class. And while he understands Spanish, maybe he doesn't actively use it with peers or feel a strong personal commitment to organizing or participating in Salvadoran cultural events at school. He's functional in both, but his commitment leans heavily towards the mainstream.
I see. Or it could be the other way around.
Exactly. Conversely, you might have a student who, despite being perfectly capable in the classroom and achieving academic success, primarily identifies with and commits to their ethnic culture. Perhaps they only feel comfortable expressing their full ethnic identity within a specific cultural club, or an after-school program with peers from their own background, or maybe exclusively within their family context. Functional, but with an ethnic orientation.
Okay, that distinction makes sense. Were there other models besides Ramirez's?
Yes, building on these ideas, Laframboise, Coleman, and Girton in 1993 proposed two influential categories that focus perhaps more on behavioral strategies: alternation and fusion.
Alternation and fusion. Okay, what's the difference there?
Alternation describes individuals who display this remarkable flexibility, shifting between their two cultures based on the situation or context. They might adopt one cultural frame, a specific set of values, behaviors, communication styles in one setting, and then seamlessly switch to another cultural frame in a different setting. It's really about adapting to the immediate environment.
So with alternation, it's almost like a mental code switching, and not just for language, but for entire cultural frameworks. That's fascinating to imagine, like having different personas for different contexts.
That's a fantastic question because it does go much deeper than just language, although language switching or code switching is often the most visible manifestation.
Right.
We're talking about individuals adapting their entire set of cognitive styles, their values, their emotional expression, even their sense of self, depending on the cultural context they're in. They're essentially accessing different mental toolkits, each optimally designed for a specific cultural setting.
Wow. Okay, and fusion.
Fusion goes beyond just switching back and forth. These individuals subscribe to a fused or emergent third culture. It's not just mixing, it's more like a creative blend that transcends the original two, forming a new, unique cultural identity. Think of it like a chemical reaction where the original elements are transformed into something entirely new.
A new hybrid culture, almost.
Exactly. Berman, in 1994, actually built on this, adding concepts like blended, which aligns pretty closely with fusion, and also instrumental, someone competent in both cultures but maybe identified with neither, perhaps using cultures for practical gain, and integrated, which was similar to Ramirez's functional ethnic type.
So lots of different labels were floating around.
Yes, and Finney and Vevich Navarro later found support for blended and alternating types in their research, but they noted a crucial distinction. Alternating biculturals might experience a sense of internal conflict as they switch, whereas blended ones generally do not because their identities feel more seamlessly merged.
Ah, so that hints at the internal feeling, the subjective experience.
Precisely. That was one of the early hints that the internal experience really mattered, beyond just the observable behavior.
But the sources highlight a conceptual limitation here, right? These typologies, even with those nuances, sometimes mixed up different aspects of the bicultural experience, which could lead to misunderstandings, especially for someone trying to understand a child's internal world.
Exactly right. The main critique is that these early typologies often confounded identity, how one fundamentally sees oneself, like being blended or fused, which is part of your self-concept, with behavioral markers, how one acts, like alternating or code switching in response to external cues.
Okay, identity versus behavior. Why is that distinction so important?
It's subtle, but incredibly important for you to grasp as an educator. An individual can have deeply blended identity, for instance, someone who genuinely sees themselves as Jewish American, a true product of both cultures, a single coherent self-concept, and still alternate behaviors. They might speak mainstream English in one context and Yiddish in another, depending on the situation, the social cues, or who they're with.
So just because a student switches their behavior or language, it doesn't necessarily mean their internal identity isn't integrated or that they feel conflicted inside.
Exactly. That's the key takeaway. This means blended and alternating aren't necessarily different types of people, but rather different components or dimensions of the bicultural experience.
Ah, I see.
Blending one's two cultural identities is not incompatible with alternating between different cultural behavioral repertoires. Given this, the validity of those early blended versus alternating groupings as separate, rigid types of biculturals became unclear.
Right.
This insight is crucial because it helps us move beyond rigid labels and understand the dynamic interplay between internal identity and external behavior. For you, an educator, this means a student who seems to alternate between cultural behaviors at school versus home isn't necessarily conflicted. They might simply be navigating context appropriately, even if they deeply feel both identities are an intrinsic part of who they are. It emphasizes looking beyond surface actions to understand the deeper identity structure.
So if those early typologies had these conceptual limitations, kind of mixing apples and oranges, how did researchers develop a more nuanced, flexible, and maybe more accurate way to understand the subjective experience of managing dual cultural identities? This is where the concept of bicultural identity integration, or BII, steps in, I assume.
You've hit on the core problem that BII was developed to address.
Exactly. To overcome the shortcomings of earlier models, Benny Martinez and colleagues introduced BII back in 2002.
Okay.
It's not just about what cultures you have been exposed to, but crucially how you perceive and experience the relationship between them.
The perception bit is key.
It is. It's an individual difference variable that captures the phenomenology of managing one's dual cultural identities. That's a bit of jargon, but it just means it's about how individuals personally interpret, feel about, and mentally organize their two cultural orientations, not just whether they possess them.
Got it. Their personal experience.
Right. And BII as a framework isn't a single monolithic construct. It actually encompasses two distinct and, importantly, psychometrically independent components.
Two components. Okay, what are they? The first component is cultural blendedness versus compartmentalization. This refers to the degree of dissociation versus overlap perceived between the two cultural orientations. Do you see your cultures as entirely separate entities, or do you perceive them as intertwined and integrated into a single cohesive self?
Overlap versus separation in your mind.
Exactly. Our sources give a great illustrative quote to clarify this. Someone saying, "I see myself as a Chinese in the United States," reflects lower blendedness or more compartmentalization. They see themselves primarily as Chinese, situated within the U.S. context, rather than a blend of the two.
Okay.
In stark contrast, someone saying, "I am a Chinese American," suggests higher blendedness. They've fused the two identities into one coherent self-concept where both are integral and maybe indistinguishable.
Can we think about that in a classroom context?
Yeah, definitely. Consider a student who seems to keep their home culture completely separate from their school culture. Perhaps they speak their heritage language and follow family customs strictly at home, engaging deeply with their cultural community outside of school hours. But at school, they only speak English, maybe avoid talking about their family's traditions, and might not invite school friends to their culturally specific events or vice versa. This would reflect compartmentalization. It's like two distinct parallel worlds they inhabit, never mixing friends or activities from one realm with the other.
Very separate worlds.
On the other hand, a student who seamlessly integrates their cultural heritage into their school identity, perhaps bringing a traditional snack to share with classmates, or drawing on unique cultural perspectives for a creative writing project, or sharing traditional stories, shows higher blendedness. They find ways to make both identities visible and valuable in their daily school life.
Okay, that's blendedness versus compartmentalization. What's the second component?
The second component is cultural harmony versus conflict. This is about the degree of tension or clash versus compatibility perceived between the two cultures. Do the values, beliefs, or practices of your two cultures feel at odds with each other? Or do they feel aligned and complementary? It's more about the feeling between the cultures.
Harmony versus conflict. Got it. The emotional tone.
Exactly. Again, the sources provide clear examples. "I feel trapped between the two cultures," indicates lower harmony or more conflict. This person feels pulled in different, opposing directions, like their cultural worlds are constantly clashing.
That sounds stressful.
It can be. Whereas "I do not see conflict between the Chinese and American ways of doing things," shows higher harmony. They perceive their cultural values and practices as largely compatible, finding common ground or ways to reconcile apparent differences.
And how might that play out for a student?
Well, a student might express feeling caught between family expectations, say regarding career choices like strong family pressure to pursue medicine, or social activities like attending a family gathering versus a school dance. They might experience internal conflict because these expectations seem to clash with peer norms or school values, leading to stress or difficulty making choices. That's low harmony. Another student, however, might find ways to reconcile or even leverage both sets of expectations, perhaps by explaining school activities to their family in a way that respects family values, or bringing their school friends to a family cultural event. They experience harmony, finding common ground or creative solutions between their two cultural worlds. They manage to navigate both sets of demands without feeling internally torn.
So it's not just about having two cultures, but how you feel about and perceive the relationship between them, whether they blend or clash. And these two components, blendedness and harmony, they can show up in any combination, meaning a student could be very blended but still feel a lot of internal conflict.
Exactly. You've grasped the nuance perfectly. You could indeed have high blendedness and low harmony, or low blendedness and high harmony. Any combination is possible, which truly speaks to the complexity of individual experience.
That is complex.
And what's fascinating here, as we touched on, is that the BII framework emphasizes subjective perceptions. It's not about how objectively different two cultures are based on external measures, like comparing national values on some scale.
Right.
It's how an individual perceives and experiences that difference, and that's what truly drives their internal state. Our sources highlight a crucial study of over 7,000 immigrant adolescents that really drives this point home.
What did it find?
This research found that objective cultural differences, for example, a country's individualism-collectivism score, as measured by things like Hofstede's dimensions, did not consistently relate to a person's psychological adjustment.
Really? So the actual difference didn't matter much for their well-being?
Not directly, no.
Yeah.
Instead, it was the perceived distance and the perceived conflict between cultures that truly mattered to the individual's experience and well-being.
Wow, this is a truly profound insight for anyone working with children from diverse backgrounds. It means a student's internal experience isn't dictated by some broad, theoretical, cultural comparison chart, but by their deeply personal feelings about how their cultures fit together.
Precisely. It puts the individual's perspective front and center.
So how do researchers actually measure these two components of BII? How do they get at these subjective experiences? Is there like a questionnaire?
Yes, exactly. The sources describe the development of the Bicultural Identity Integration Scale, or BIAS. And, this wasn't something they perfected on the first try, which is very common in developing robust psychological measures.
Right, it takes refinement.
Definitely. The early versions, like BIAP and BIAS-1, had limitations. The pilot version, BIAS-P, used just a single vignette that participants rated, but it ended up kind of confounding the two components, blendedness and harmony, mixing them into one statement.
Okay. Not ideal.
No. Then BIAS-1, the first multi-item version, tried to separate them, but still faced limitations in reliability and didn't cover enough content domains. It was a learning process.
So they kept working on it.
They did. And that led to the latest version, BIAS-2. This is the more robust and widely used tool today, developed by Hun in 2009. It's a 19-item scale where participants rate statements on a 5-point Likert scale, from strongly disagree to strongly agree.
Okay, 19 questions. What makes this version better?
What makes the BIAS-2 effective is its strong reliability in measuring both blendedness, with a Cronbach's alpha of 0.86, which is quite high, indicating good internal consistency, and harmony, with an alpha of 0.81, and crucially, it measures them as separate, distinct components.
Separate is key.
Absolutely. While they are moderately correlated, the study found an OR value of 0.36, suggesting some relationship. They are indeed distinguishable in factor analyses. What this means in simpler terms for you as an educator is that these aren't just two ways of talking about the same thing. They are genuinely different, measurable aspects of a student's internal experience that you can observe and support independently. You can have a student who feels very blended but is still experiencing conflict, or vice versa.
Can you give us an idea of what the questions are like?
Sure. To give you a feel for what the scale actually asks, for blendedness, a sample item might be something like, I feel and American at the same time, where the blank is filled with the person's other cultural identity, like Chinese or Mexican.
Okay.
For harmony, an item might be, I find it easy to harmonize in American cultures. There are also reverse-scored items to capture the compartmentalization and conflict ends of the spectrum, like, I feel trapped between my two cultures.
Got it. So it measures both the structure and the feel.
Yep, exactly. And the rigorous development of a robust measurement tool like the Bicultural was absolutely essential for moving this research forward. It allowed for more precise and nuanced study of how these two distinct dimensions impact individuals.
All right.
And for you, an educator, knowing that these aspects are distinct means you can look for different cues in your students' behavior and emotional states, allowing for more targeted and empathetic support.
So we've learned what BII is, how it's broken down into blendedness and harmony, and how it's measured. But what does this all mean for the individual? How does someone's level of BII actually impact their life, their psychological well-being, their thinking processes, their social behavior? What are the consequences?
That's the million-dollar question, right?
Well,
What are the real-world consequences of how you integrate your identities? Well, when BII was first studied more broadly, often as a unitary construct before researchers really nailed down the two separate components, there was a strong, consistent link found to greater psychological adjustment. It paints a very clear picture.
better adjustment overall if you have higher BII.
Yes, higher BII was consistently associated with a whole host of positive outcomes. Greater self-esteem, higher life satisfaction, increased subjective happiness, and importantly, lower rates of challenging mental health issues like depression, anxiety, and loneliness.
Wow, that's a broad range of benefits.
And it is, and this wasn't just found in one specific group. It was observed across incredibly diverse populations from Chinese adult immigrants in Hong Kong to native-born college students in Quebec navigating, say, English and French Canadian cultures. The finding held up.
So for an elementary education major listening, this is pretty profound, isn't it?
Absolutely. It suggests that fostering a sense of integrated bicultural identity in your students could have direct and far-reaching positive impacts on their mental health, their social adjustment, their overall well-being.
It's not just about culture, it's about mental health.
Exactly. Creating an environment where students feel seen, affirmed, and supported in their multifaceted identities isn't just about cultural sensitivity or curriculum choices. It's about actively promoting their psychological health and resilience. It's about helping them build a strong internal foundation.
That makes intuitive sense. If you feel your identities are harmonized and flow together, you're likely to be better adjusted. But you mentioned something earlier, and the sources highlight it too, a really surprising finding about cognitive complexity. This sounds like it turns our usual assumptions about conflict being bad completely on their head. How does BII relate to how people actually think?
Right. Here's where it gets really interesting and perhaps quite counterintuitive for many educators. This is one of the most remarkable insights from the research, I think.
Okay, I'm intrigued.
Studies by Benny Martinez and colleagues back in 2006, specifically looking at Chinese American undergraduate students, found something quite unexpected.
What was it?
Individuals who scored low on BII, meaning they experienced more compartmentalization or significant internal conflict between their cultures, actually had more cognitively complex representations of culture.
Wait, low BII, more conflict,
Right.
led to more complexity, not less.
Exactly. When asked to describe their cultures, they didn't just give simple surface-level descriptions. Instead, they provided more abstract, dense, and intricate descriptions. They used multiple perspectives, they actively compared and contrasted concepts between cultures, and they included a greater number of ideas and words in their descriptions. They made evaluative judgments and offered nuanced interpretations. It showed a deeper, more systematic, and more sophisticated processing of cultural information.
That is fascinating. So the struggle, the tension, might actually be making them think more deeply about culture.
That's what the research strongly suggests. This is a huge aha moment for you as an educator, right? It challenges the common notion that emotional or identity conflict is purely negative.
It really does.
It implies that while low BII might be associated with more internal tension and potentially some psychological distress, it can also lead to a distinct strength in cognitive processing.
A strength born from struggle.
Perhaps. A student who seems to be struggling with cultural differences, maybe verbally expressing frustration or difficulty reconciling home and school expectations, might actually be engaging in deeper, more systematic, and more nuanced thinking about those differences than a peer who simply blends everything seamlessly without much thought.
So how should a teacher approach that?
Well, instead of viewing their conflict or compartmentalization as purely a deficit or a problem to be solved, a teacher can recognize and maybe even foster this cognitive strength.
Uh,
You could encourage them to articulate their multifaceted perspectives in class discussions, maybe ask them to compare and contrast cultural viewpoints in a history or literature project, or even invite them to write about their experiences of navigating different cultural expectations. This validates their internal process and leverages it as a unique intellectual asset. You might be identifying a future critical thinker or diplomat in the making.
that completely reframes the idea of conflict. Seeing it as a potential catalyst for complex thought and deeper processing is really powerful.
Okay, so it affects internal states, cognitive processes. What about social interactions? Does BII impact someone's social networks, particularly maybe in a school setting?
Yes, it absolutely does, and in ways that are very relevant to understanding students' social lives at school. In a sample of Chinese-American individuals studied, those who scored high on BII had social networks that were both more expansive and more integrated.
Expansive and integrated, what does that mean practically?
Well, specifically, their social circles included more friends from the dominant culture. And even more interestingly, their dominant culture friends and their ethnic culture friends were more interconnected, meaning these friends actually knew each other and interacted.
Ah, so their different social worlds weren't totally separate.
Exactly. It created a bridge between these two worlds, not just within the individual's mind, but within their actual social life.
What are the implications of that? Well, it suggests that higher BII might facilitate broader social integration. It could help in building bridges between cultural groups within an individual's social circle. For you, as an educator, this means that supporting a student in developing higher BII could indirectly lead to them forming more diverse friendships.
Right.
Which could, in turn, create a more cohesive and welcoming school community, potentially even helping bridge gaps between different student groups who might otherwise remain separate. Imagine a student whose high BII allows them to effortlessly connect classmates from different cultural backgrounds, fostering understanding and reducing social divides just through their own integrated network.
That's a great point. Now let's really unpack the unique links between the two separate components of BII blendedness and harmony and how they relate to specific outcomes. This is where we get into the real nuance, you said, demonstrating why it was so important for researchers to distinguish between them.
Exactly. The research clearly delineates their distinct impacts, showing why separating these two dimensions was so vital, as their influences on an individual's life are quite different. Let's start with BII harmony.
Okay, harmony, the effective, emotional part. How compatible or conflicted cultures feel.
Right. This component is consistently and strongly related to lower rates of depression and or anxiety symptoms.
Ah, so harmony is directly linked to mental health.
Very much so. It's profoundly about feeling good, feeling at peace, experiencing a sense of coherence within your cultural identities. It's also positively correlated with ethnic identity affirmation, meaning it's linked to holding positive attitudes toward one's ethnic group. If you feel harmony, you tend to feel positive about your heritage.
Makes sense. What influences harmony levels?
Harmony seems to be driven more strongly by contextual pressures. What this means is that external experiences significantly impact a person's sense of cultural harmony.
Like what kind of experience?
Things like perceived discrimination, problematic intercultural relations, maybe negative interactions with people from the dominant culture, or even other ethnic groups and linguistic problems, like feeling unable to express oneself fully. These can all significantly decrease a person's sense of harmony.
So negative external experiences directly impact internal harmony.
It seems so. And interestingly, harmony has weak relations with traditional acculturation variables like, say, language proficiency on its own, suggesting that simply being fluent in English doesn't guarantee harmony. It's more about the emotional experience of cultural compatibility, not just linguistic ability.
Okay. So for a teacher, noticing a student showing signs of anxiety or withdrawal,
Yes.
it could be linked to unaddressed cultural conflict they perceive between home and school.
It very well could be. Perhaps they feel their family's values clash with what's expected at school, or maybe they've experienced subtle microaggressions or even direct discrimination related to their cultural background.
So what can the school or teacher do?
Creating an inclusive classroom where diverse cultural expressions are not just tolerated, but actively valued and celebrated Maybe dedicating time for students to share cultural traditions, incorporating diverse texts, swiftly addressing any discriminatory behavior could directly foster a sense of harmony for these students, and that could lead to improvements in their well-being, engagement, and overall sense of belonging.
Okay, so harmony is about feeling good, linked to context and well-being. What about BII blendedness? The structural part, how overlapped or separate cultures are in the mind.
Right. Blendedness. This is linked to the overlap in self and group stereotypes, meaning how much individuals perceive their own personality aligning with a typical person from both their cultures.
Correct.
It's also strongly related to exposure to American culture, like years in the U.S., English proficiency, identification with U.S. culture, and stronger integration attitudes, basically. A desire to integrate both cultures rather than separating or assimilating.
So more exposure and wanting to integrate leads to higher blendedness.
That's the pattern, yes. If you've been more exposed and you want to integrate, you're more likely to feel blended.
Now, how does blendedness relate to well-being? Does it also predict lower anxiety, like harmony does?
This is the crucial distinction. Blendedness is largely unrelated to psychological adjustment issues like depression or anxiety.
Really? So feeling blended doesn't necessarily mean you feel better?
Not directly in terms of those specific mental health outcomes, no.
Yep.
It's more about the cognitive organization of identities and maybe behavioral engagement. It's about how you structure your identity, not necessarily how you feel about the relationship between the parts.
Wow. Okay.
So a student might have a highly blended identity, seeing themselves as fully, seamlessly both one culture and another, without that necessarily reducing their anxiety if other factors are causing conflict. Low harmony. This really highlights why separating the two components was so vital for a nuanced understanding.
Can you give a classroom example for blendedness?
Sure. Think about a student who is equally comfortable participating in a school-wide talent show featuring American pop songs and also organizing a booth for a cultural diversity fair where they teach classmates a traditional dance from their heritage culture.
Okay, active in both spheres.
Right. They might actively participate in both school and community events linked to both cultures and feel comfortable switching between different social groups, different sets of friends, without much internal fuss. This student demonstrates high blendedness in their behaviors and identity presentation.
And a teacher might notice that fluidity.
Exactly. And they could use it to promote cross-cultural understanding among students, perhaps by asking the student to lead a project that bridges cultural perspectives as they demonstrate a natural capacity for cultural synthesis.
Knowing the profound impact of BII, especially harmony on well-being and low BII, potentially on cognitive complexity, the next natural question is, how does someone actually develop an integrated bicultural identity? What specific factors contribute to high or low blendedness and harmony? Is it simply a matter of individual choice, or are there broader influences at play?
That's a critical question, especially for anyone looking to support this process in young people. While, as we said, much of the research on BII is correlational, showing associations rather than direct cause and effect, the sources offer compelling theoretical propositions regarding the developmental process of BII.
Okay.
This helps us understand why some individuals might integrate their identities differently than others, and crucially, it highlights areas where educators and communities might exert positive influence.
What are some of those factors?
Well, first, let's consider large-scale contextual factors, things like the history and the current status of a particular cultural group within the dominant culture. These are big societal forces.
History and status. How does that play out?
The sources provide a really striking example from that Finney and DeVitch-Navarro study from 1997. They found that the majority of African-American adolescents in their sample were typically blended biculturals, often showing high BII.
Okay. Why might that be?
The researchers suggest this might be due to African Americans' long and stable history within the United States. This has allowed for the development of a widespread and distinct African American culture that has been integrated, albeit often amidst struggle within the broader American context over centuries.
Right, a long-standing cultural presence.
Exactly. In contrast, the majority of Mexican American adolescents in that same study were more often alternating biculturals, which is associated with lower BII.
And the reasoning there.
This is possibly due to ongoing and often controversial immigration debates and societal tensions, which can impose an ever-present immigrant status or a sense of being othered, even on those who are not immigrants themselves. These societal pressures might predispose individuals to feeling more tension or needing to alternate between their cultural worlds rather than seamlessly blending them.
So broader politics and history can shape individual identity integration.
It strongly suggests that, yes. Broader societal narratives, historical contexts, current political climates can significantly shape individual identity development, even for children who may not directly engage with these complex debates themselves.
What does that mean for an educator?
As an educator, understanding these historical and social pressures provides critical context for a student's experience. It helps you recognize that a student's perceived conflict or tendency to compartmentalize might not be purely personal or an individual failing, but could be deeply rooted in broader societal dynamics impacting their community. This really calls for empathy and advocacy for inclusive practices that acknowledge these realities and create a safe, validating space within the school environment.
That's a really important perspective. What about more individual factors? Does personality play a role?
It does seem to. Beyond these large societal forces, dispositional factors, meaning innate personality traits, also appear to play a role in how someone navigates their dual identities.
Like what traits?
The sources indicate that individuals who are more neurotic, or perhaps less emotionally stable, tend to perceive lower harmony between their cultures.
That makes intuitive sense.
It does, right. If you're generally prone to anxiety, mood swings, or negative emotions, you might be more likely to perceive conflict or tension in your cultural experiences. On the flip side, those who are more open to new experiences tend to perceive greater blendedness between their cultures.
Openness leads to blendedness.
It seems so. Their natural curiosity, intellectual adventurousness, and adaptability might make it easier for them to see their cultures as overlapping and integrated, rather than separate and distinct.
So personality interacts with the cultural experience.
Exactly. It highlights this fascinating interplay between innate personality and how one navigates cultural identities. While you can't change a student's core personality, understanding this can help you tailor your support.
How so?
For a student who appears more neurotic, maybe you provide more explicit emotional regulation strategies or help them articulate their feelings of conflict in a safe way. For one who is very open, perhaps you offer more diverse cultural experiences to further foster their natural tendency toward blendedness.
Okay. And what about the immediate environment? Daily life.
This is probably the most directly actionable area for educators. The immediate social environment and experiences the daily interactions and contexts a student navigates.
What kind of daily experiences matter most?
Personal, everyday experiences directly and profoundly influence BII. The sources show that experiences with discrimination, interpersonal problems with culturally different others, and linguistic barriers were all consistently associated with bicultural individuals' perception of lower BII harmony.
So negative interactions really hurt harmony.
Yes. These are the kinds of negative interactions, feeling excluded, misunderstood, judged, that make cultural identities feel at odds or create that internal tension. Furthermore, linguistic barriers, difficulty communicating fluently in one or both languages, and culturally isolated environments, places where there isn't much opportunity for cross-cultural interaction or where one's culture isn't adequately represented, were associated with lower BII blendedness.
So lack of communication or interaction hinders blending.
It makes sense, right? If you can't easily speak the dominant language, or if you're always in a monocultural setting, it's harder to see your cultures as intertwined or to integrate them behaviorally.
This sounds like where schools can really make a difference.
Absolutely. This is highly actionable for you as an educator, as these are factors largely within the school's influence. Creating an inclusive classroom environment where cultural differences are celebrated and seen as assets. Actively addressing and preventing discrimination, even subtle microaggressions or teasing. Fostering positive intercultural relations among students through things like collaborative projects. Providing robust language acquisition support for English learners. All of these can directly enhance students' BII harmony and blendedness.
So creating that positive, supportive, interactive environment is key.
It really is. Think about providing opportunities for students to learn about each other's cultures respectfully, intervening immediately if you hear culturally insensitive remarks, and ensuring language support is accessible and destigmatized. These actions create a truly supportive environment for identity integration.
So it's a dynamic mix of big societal forces, individual personality traits, and critically, the everyday interactions and environments. That gives us a lot to consider. But how do blendedness and harmony actually interact in their development? Do they influence each other, or are they completely separate tracks?
That's a perceptive question, and the sources propose a fascinating developmental model to explain this interplay, though they do note it still awaits more robust empirical examination. It suggests a dynamic, often complex relationship.
Okay, what's the proposed model?
The core proposition is that objective cultural distance, how different two cultures actually are in terms of values, practices, social structures, may primarily lead to low BII harmony, meaning high conflict.
So real differences can create real conflict.
Potentially, yes. For example, if two cultures truly have conflicting norms regarding, say, individual autonomy versus collective obligation, or very different views on dating or marriage practices, it's likely to generate internal tension for someone trying to navigate both.
But there's a twist.
Yes, the model adds a crucial caveat. If these two cultures are kept rigidly separate or compartmentalized, then the individual might not even recognize or perceive the conflict at all. The underlying conflict only becomes apparent or emotionally salient when the worlds start to collide or the person actively attempts to blend them.
So trying to blend might bring the conflict to the surface.
It could, yeah. And the model suggests an interesting interplay based on that. It proposes that subjective cultural distance, which manifests as low blendedness or high compartmentalization, may actually be a response to high BII conflict, low harmony.
Wait, so compartmentalizing might be a reaction to feeling conflict.
That's the idea. Individuals might attempt to resolve or avoid internal conflict by choosing to compartmentalize or separate their identities. For example, if a student feels a deep clash between their family's very collective cultural values and the individualistic values promoted at school,
Yes.
they might choose to keep those two cultural worlds strictly separate, having one set of friends for school, another for home, to avoid the emotional strain of trying to reconcile them.
Wow. That's a really empathetic insight for a teacher.
Isn't it? It means that a student who seems to keep their cultural worlds very separate, always speaking English at school, never sharing about home life, having distinct friend groups for each context, might not just be a compartmentalized type by preference.
They might be coping.
Exactly. And they might be doing so to manage underlying feelings of conflict that they haven't been able to resolve or blend. This perspective invites greater understanding and strategic support. Rather than seeing the separation as a failure to integrate, you can view it as a coping mechanism.
And look for ways to maybe gently bridge those worlds.
Perhaps, yeah. By validating both aspects of their identity and creating safe, low-pressure spaces for cultural expression. However, the model also notes that blending or compartmentalizing isn't always successful in resolving conflict due to deep cultural and situational constraints. Some conflicts simply cannot be fully reconciled by the individual alone, which further underpins the theoretical and empirical independence of BII blendedness and harmony. They influence each other, but one doesn't fully determine the other.
So we've explored the components of BII, blendedness, and harmony, and how they develop, influenced by context, personality, and experience, and how they might interact. Let's talk about how this internal integration, or maybe lack thereof, actually manifests externally, especially through something called cultural frame switching. What is that exactly, and how does BII play a role in shaping it?
Cultural frame switching is a really fascinating phenomenon, very common among bicultural individuals, and it's a powerful illustration of BII in action. It's essentially the ability to shift their cultural thoughts, emotional responses, and behaviors in response to specific cultural cues or primes in their environment.
Like flipping a switch based on context.
Kind of, yeah. Think of it like accessing different mental toolkits, each optimally designed for a specific cultural context.
And this affects more than just language.
Oh, much more. The shifting isn't just superficial. It can occur across various deep domains, influencing cognitive styles, like whether one thinks more holistically or analytically, personality expression, maybe acting more introverted or extroverted, self-identification, how you define yourself in that moment, cultural values, self-control, how you view yourself in relation to others, independent or interdependent, affect your emotions, and even decision-making processes.
Oh, it's a deep shift.
It really can be. And what's fascinating here, connecting back to BII, is that BII levels profoundly influence how individuals frame switch. It leads to very different behavioral patterns, almost like they have different operating systems based on their BII level.
Different patterns. How so?
Well, high BII individuals, those who perceive high blendedness and harmony between their cultures, tend to perform prime consistent behaviors.
Prime consistent. Right.
Meaning if they're primed with, say, a Chinese cultural symbol or a reminder of their Chinese heritage, they will readily behave in ways consistent with Chinese norms or values in that context.
Why is that?
It's likely because they perceive their cultures as non-oppositional and compatible, allowing for fluid and appropriate switching. It's like having two well-organized, easily accessible files in their mental mental cabinet, and they can pull out the right one for the right situation without any fuss.
Okay, smooth switching for high BII. What about low BII?
In stark contrast, low BII individual, those who perceive their cultures as conflicted or highly compartmentalized, tend to display prime-resistant behaviors.
Prime resistant. They resist the prime.
Sort of. If primed with Chinese culture, they might actually behave in American ways, or vice versa. It's counterintuitive.
Why would they do that? React against the prime.
The sources suggest this may be because they chronically polarize their two cultures, viewing them as opposites, perhaps even feeling a sense of threat or opposition between them. So priming one culture might lead to the activation of the other culture through a process of comparison and contrast, or maybe even a kind of rebellious resistance to the perceived opposite. It's like having two files that are constantly arguing, and when you open one, the other one immediately tries to assert itself in opposition.
That's incredible. Can you give a classroom example of how a teacher might see this?
Let's try. Imagine you're doing a class activity where students are asked to maybe prime themselves with a cultural experience, perhaps listening to music from a specific culture, or looking at images of a cultural celebration and then respond to a prompt about a personal goal.
Okay.
A student with high BII might be primed by a picture of, say, a Japanese tea ceremony, and then when asked to describe a personal goal, speak about it with a strong focus on collective harmony and the good of the group, reflecting those Japanese cultural values of prime, consistent behavior.
Right, matching the prime.
Exactly. Another student who has low BII and perhaps feels a lot of conflict between their heritage culture and the dominant school culture might be given the same Japanese prime. But then when asked about a goal, they might speak very strongly about individual achievement and standing out from the crowd, maybe emphasizing competition, a prime-resistant behavior, leaning into the perceived opposite American value.
Wow.
As a teacher, observing these patterns can give you profound insight into their internal BII dynamics and help you understand why they might respond to situations in unexpected ways. It's a powerful window into how they've organized their internal cultural world.
That's a really powerful insight, showing how internal identity organization impacts outward behavior, sometimes in very surprising, almost oppositional ways. But the sources also suggest that the principles of BII aren't just limited to ethnocultural identities, right? This could be a real game changer for someone interested in broader psychological applications, not just in cultural studies, but understanding identity more generally.
That's a crucial point. Absolutely. It raises that important question. Can we apply these concepts of blendedness and harmony to other aspects of identity that don't involve nationality or ethnicity?
And the answer is?
A resounding yes. This is where the BII framework becomes incredibly versatile and broadly applicable for understanding the human experience. The principles of BII can extend to any dual identity or even multiple identities beyond just two cultures.
Any dual identity, like what?
Well, the sources provide compelling examples of this broader applicability. They discuss things like sexual identity.
Okay.
This includes how, for instance, a lesbian woman might integrate her identification with lesbian culture and mainstream heterosexual culture, or how Muslim gay men navigate their sexual and religious identities, which can often feel conflicting in certain contexts.
Yeah.
Do they feel harmony or conflict between these deeply personal parts of themselves? Do they compartmentalize them or blend them?
Right, the same principles apply.
Right.
What else?
Religious identity. Think about how an individual might integrate, say, a Buddhist identity with a dominant culture's Christian identity, especially when societal norms or family expectations might favor one over the other. How do they manage that integration internally?
Makes sense.
And professional identity. A particularly fascinating example cited is female engineers integrating their gender identity with their professional identity. This is a powerful demonstration of how BII extends beyond ethnocultural boundaries.
Female engineers. How did BII apply there?
The research mentioned found that female engineers with more integrated identities, meaning high blendedness between their gender and professional identity, seeing themselves seamlessly as a female engineer rather than, say, a female who happens to be an engineer, actually design more creative products.
Wow. Better integration led to more creativity.
That's what the study found. It demonstrates a tangible, measurable, and positive outcome of high BII that goes beyond just psychological adjustment into actual performance and innovation.
Can we translate that to a classroom? How might this apply to students' other identities?
Absolutely. Think about a student who is both, say, a gifted artist and a dedicated athlete. Do they feel these identities clash, jocks versus artists stereotype, or do they find ways to integrate them?
Right.
Perhaps a student who sees themselves as an artist-athlete finds unique ways to express creativity in sports, maybe designing innovative plays or bringing an artistic flair to their performance. Or maybe they bring the discipline, teamwork, and strategic thinking learned in sports into their art projects, fostering greater focus and collaborative skills.
So helping them integrate helps them in both areas.
It could. For you, an educator, this means understanding that helping students integrate seemingly disparate interests or roles, like being a science whiz and a talented musician, or a quiet student who is also a powerful debater, or even a child who is a caregiver at home and a dedicated student at school, can foster more holistic development, reduce internal conflict, and even boost their overall performance and creativity in both domains.
It's not just about ethnic identity. It's about helping students build a coherent, integrated self across all their important roles and talents.
Exactly. It helps you see the whole complex child. The sources also mention extending this to multiple identities, like multiracial identity integration or even tricultural identity integration, citing Chinese Canadians in English, French, Quebec as an example, navigating 3 distinct cultural spheres.
So the framework is really flexible.
Extremely. This is incredibly valuable for you as an educator. It means the challenges and strengths associated with biculturalism can provide a powerful lens for understanding students navigating any dual or multiple identities. The concepts of harmony and blendedness offer a flexible framework for understanding their internal experience and supporting their overall adjustment, creativity, and self-expression.
So BII is truly a powerful lens, not just for cultural identity, but for understanding how people integrate any dual or multiple identities. That's a huge area of exploration. What other concepts from related fields, maybe sociology or anthropology, can further enrich our understanding of identity integration? And what's next for this incredibly important area of research? Where is it heading?
Indeed. The sources highlight several exciting areas for future research that have the potential to further elucidate BII, drawing insights from sociology, anthropology, and education. It really shows the interdisciplinary nature of identity studies, pulling insights from many fields to build a fuller picture.
What are some of those related concepts?
Well, first, there's the distinction between biculturation versus acculturation.
Biculturation. How's that different from acculturation?
Acculturation, as we discussed, traditionally assumes one culture, often the ethnic one, is learned first, and then another, the dominant one, is adapted to, usually sequentially. Biculturation, however, allows for the possibility of simultaneous learning of 2 cultures.
Oh, learning both at the same time from the start.
Exactly. This is particularly relevant and maybe more inclusive for the experiences of mixed ethnic individuals and second-generation children of immigrants who might grow up learning both their heritage culture and the dominant culture concurrently from birth or very early on.
Is there an analogy for that?
The sources draw a great analogy to linguistics. It's similar to coordinate bilingualism, where 2 languages are learned separately in different contexts, with perhaps more distinct mental systems, like learning French in France and then English in England, versus compound bilingualism, where 2 languages are learned simultaneously, often in the same context, maybe with more overlapping mental systems, like a child growing up with parents speaking different languages in the same home.
Okay, coordinate versus compound. And how might biculturation relate to BII?
Well, the speculation or hypothesis is that simultaneous cultural learning, biculturation, might lead to higher blendedness as the 2 cultural systems are integrated from an earlier age, potentially with fewer perceived initial conflicts. But this is a crucial area for future research to really test and unpack.
Interesting. What else?
Second, there's the concept of hybridity, sometimes called an emergent third culture, which we touched on briefly with fusion.
Right, the new blend.
Yes. This refers to a new culture that emerges from a dynamic interaction, not just a simple summation, of existing cultures. It's a creative, often organic blend that forms its own distinct identity, complete with its own norms, values, practices.
Like Chicano culture you mentioned.
Exactly. Chicano culture, drawing from Mexican, U.S.-American, and unique Mexican-American elements, evolving into something distinct. Or British Indian culture, distinct from both mainstream British and traditional Indian cultures, even giving us culinary inventions like chicken tikka masala, which is a hybrid creation.
And how does this connect to BII?
The sources suggest there appear to be many parallels between hybridity and BII blendedness. Is hybridity simply a macro-level manifestation of high blendedness at the individual level? Or are there important distinctions in how these concepts operate at different scales? Can individual blendedness contribute to the formation of new hybrid cultures? It's a fruitful area for comparative research.
Okay, what's next?
Third, let's look at panethnicity.
Panethnicity, like identifying with a broader group.
Precisely. Identification with a broader racial or panethnic group, like identifying as Asian American rather than specifically Chinese American or Korean American. This often involves later generations of immigrants who may have less direct ties to a specific country of origin, but share a collective identity rooted in common experiences in the new country.
What kind of experiences?
Often it's shaped by a shared experience with discrimination, and sometimes higher socioeconomic status can foster a sense of collective identity across different ethnic subgroups. It includes the blending of multiple hyphenated ethnic cultures within that panethnicity, alongside the dominant culture.
So it's broader level of blending.
Yes, and sometimes these panethnic labels, like Hispanic, originally came from external classifications, say, by U.S. institutions grouping distinct Latin American groups. But over time, they can be internalized by many as a shared identity. Future research can explore how blendedness manifests for these individuals. Are they merging their specific ethnic culture with the dominant one, or a broader pan-ethnic culture, or both? It's key to understanding evolving identities.
Okay, another concept.
Fourth, segmented assimilation. This one is quite different.
Segmented assimilation, what does that mean?
It describes an orientation towards neither the dominant culture nor the original ethnic culture, but instead an orientation towards an impoverished, underprivileged, often reactive racial minority segment of the dominant society.
Can you give an example?
The source mentions some low-income Vietnamese Americans in New Orleans who were observed to identify more closely with and be friends with the traditionally low-income marginalized group in that city, African Americans. They found solidarity and a sense of belonging there rather than fully in either their original Vietnamese culture or the broader dominant white culture.
So choosing a different group altogether.
Or perhaps being pushed towards it. The sources suggest this could be a third possible response to identity conflict beyond just blending or compartmentalizing. As a way of resolving conflicts between their two main cultures, individuals may choose to, or perhaps be forced by circumstance and discrimination, to withdraw from both and seek refuge in another culture, one perhaps shared by those who face similar racial and economic conflicts and hardships. It's often associated with later generations, experiences of discrimination, and lower socioeconomic status.
How might this relate to BII?
That's a key question for future research. Could segmented assimilation relate to very low BII harmony, perhaps severe unresolved conflict leading to disengagement from both original cultures? Or maybe it relates to the marginalization acculturation strategy we discussed earlier, where individuals feel isolated from all available cultural options.
Lots to explore there. And the last concept.
Finally, and this is incredibly important for you as an educator, intersectionality.
Intersectionality. We hear that term a lot now. How does it connect here?
This concept defines the unique experience associated with having multiple identities and potentially multiple types of oppression or marginalization. It acknowledges that identities like gender, race, sexual orientation, religion, class, ability don't exist in isolation.
Right, they overlap and interact.
Exactly. They intersect and combine to create unique lived experiences, unique challenges, and also unique strengths. Individuals with multiple subordinate identities, for instance, an African-American lesbian woman, face distinct obstacles, sometimes called intersectional invisibility, where they might not be recognized as traditional members of any single group, or they might face compounded discrimination based on the intersection of their race and gender and sexuality. Their experience is truly more than the sum of its parts.
Why is this so crucial for educators?
Because a student might experience challenges not just because they are, for example, an immigrant, but because they are an immigrant girl from a low-income family who also happens to have a learning disability. Understanding how these identities intersect is absolutely essential to providing truly comprehensive and effective support.
And how does BII fit in?
BII, especially the harmony component, is highly relevant here because it helps to elucidate how people manage these complex, potentially incompatible or conflicting identities. How can a school environment recognize and support a student who falls into multiple categories, but maybe doesn't feel fully seen or understood by any single one, or who experiences unique burdens due to these intersections? It means moving beyond a single identity lens and embracing the full, complex person in front of you, understanding that identity is rarely one-dimensional.
It's a huge area of exploration,
Yeah.
and it really drives home how complex and personal identity is. The future of this research is clearly about embracing that multifaceted reality of human experience, isn't it?
Indeed. The field of biculturalism, particularly looking at it from an individual differences perspective like BII, is still relatively new in the grand scheme of psychological research. There's just so much more to discover about how increasing cultural diversity and global interconnectedness affect people's identities.
And the implications are huge.
Absolutely. The implications for individuals, for our classrooms, for our societies are vast. The BII framework is a really powerful, flexible tool that empowers us to continue this vital exploration, helping us understand not just what cultures people belong to, but how they live those cultures internally and externally.
So what does this all mean? We've covered a lot of ground. What are the big takeaways from our deep dive today?
Yeah.
We've unpacked bicultural identity integration, from its core components of blendedness and harmony to its profound impact on psychological adjustment, cognitive function, maybe even creativity. We've seen how personal experiences, large-scale societal contexts, even individual personality traits, all play a crucial role in shaping how individuals integrate their multiple cultures.
And if we connect this to the bigger picture, especially for you, our listener, perhaps working in elementary education, these insights are, I think, invaluable. They offer a much more nuanced and empathetic understanding of your students' internal worlds. It helps move beyond simple categories or labels to appreciate the complexity and, importantly, the unique strength that navigating multiple identities can bring. It equips you with a powerful framework to foster environments where students can feel harmonious and blended rather than conflicted or compartmentalized.
And maybe the most surprising, perhaps even empowering fact we uncovered is that what might traditionally seem like a struggle, like having low BII or feeling deeply conflicted between cultures, can actually be a forge for greater cognitive complexity.
Yeah, that's a key insight.
It's a powerful reminder that our perceptions of struggle can sometimes mask profound internal growth and the development of unique intellectual strengths. It really urges us to look beyond surface behaviors and try to understand the rich inner lives of our students.
And this raises an important question for you to ponder, particularly as you reflect on your own classroom or community context. How might understanding the distinct experiences of cultural blendedness versus cultural harmony help you design classroom activities or maybe support systems that not only acknowledge cultural differences, but actively celebrate the unique, multifaceted ways students integrate their diverse identities?
That's a great question to leave us with.
Thinking about how you can create spaces where all forms of integration, all these complex internal experiences are understood and valued.
Thank you for joining us on this deep dive into bicultural identity integration. We hope this exploration empowers you with new insights and maybe a deeper appreciation for the rich tapestry of human identity that surrounds us all.
Thanks for listening.
Until next time, keep digging, keep questioning, and keep connecting.